Hello, everyone. Welcome to part 2 of the Hagia Sophia Public Forum at Stanford University, hosted by the Cantor Museum. We are grateful for the sponsorship of the Art History Department, History, Religious Studies, the Center for Medieval and Early Modern Studies, the Center for Russian, Eastern European and Eurasian Studies, the Mediterranean Studies Forum of the Abbasi Program in Islamic Studies, and the Stanford Global Studies. I apologize for all this tautology, but this is part of our sponsors, and I want to speak about the broad support that we have received to run this event. I'll give a brief summary of what part 1 introduced into the discourse, and then speak about what part 2 is aiming for. In part 1, we looked at the material fabric of the building and the current state of conservation, the projects that are going on right now. And then we turned into the history of the 1930s to the 1950s with Thomas Whittemore and the uncovering of the mosaics, also the international support for this venture and the private sponsorship of American donors in the process. Then we looked at Hagia Sophia, the concept of wisdom in its Byzantine manifestation in the light and the acoustics and chant of this great space. And then we turned to the moment in which Hagia Sophia became listed on the UNESCO Heritage List and how much this inclusion is bringing the monument as part of an urban fabric. And then the conservation of the monument becomes a much more complex event that is unfolds itself as a grand curatorial gesture of urban planning, and how the recent reconversion into a mosque intended and successfully, in a sense, presented a large human bodies in that space in support of one very narrow understanding of religion and ethnic and religious identity of Turkey. The last talk focused in part 1, focused on the long tradition of exclusionism and homogenization as part of Turkish nationalism. Today, we are going to probe deeper into the 20th and 21st century history of both politics and cultural heritage in Turkey. Ali Yaycioglu is going to focus on the development of the rhetoric in the 1950s of much more conservative understanding of religion. Then Patricia Blessing is going to lead us into the Ottoman legacy in terms of the architectural imprint of Hagia Sophia on Ottoman Sultanic mosques. Then we're going to turn to Anna Bigelow, who is going to discuss the establishment of prayer space in the 80s and 90s in Hagia Sophia. And then we will expand the discourse of Hagia Sophia by turning to the medieval site of Ani and the contested cultural heritage of Turkish-Armenian tensions in that site. And the final speaker will be the journalist and political commentator and fiction writer, Ajetta Melkiran, who would speak about the rise of populist regimes and its effect on a global level by focusing on Hagia Sophia. Then we are going to engage all the panelists in a discussion, and towards the end of our program, we will introduce some of the questions that the audience had brought to the floor. Without much ado, I will now turn to my co-host, Patrick Crowley, the curator of European art at the Cantor Museum, who will introduce the first speaker.
Thank you, Bisera. My name is Patrick Crowley. I'm the Associate Curator of European Art at the Cantor Arts Center here at Stanford. Given the historical and cultural significance of Hagia Sophia's modern life as a museum, the Cantor is especially excited to host this interdisciplinary event. The structure of our program today includes presentations by 5 panelists who will speak for approximately 10 minutes each. Afterwards, the panelists will have a chance to engage in a discussion with one another for 20 minutes, which will be followed by a 10-minute Q&A session with the audience. The audience will have the opportunity to vote up questions for this segment, and a record of submitted questions will be retained so that the panelists will have an opportunity to respond to individual questions after the event as they are able. Our first speaker today is Ali Yaycıoğlu, Associate Professor of Ottoman and Middle East History and Director of the Center for Medieval and Early Modern Studies. His research centers on economic, political, and legal institutions and practices, as well as social and cultural life in Southeastern Europe and the Middle East during the Ottoman Empire. His first book, Partners of Empire, Crisis of the Ottoman Order, the Age of Revolutions, offers a rethinking of the Ottoman Empire within the global context of the revolutionary age in the 18th and early 19th centuries. Ali, without further ado, I turn it to you.
Thank you. So after 86 years, the first khutbah in Hagia Sophia was read by Ali Erbash, head of the Directorate of Religious Affairs, on July 24. Erbash ascended the mimbar, decorated with the green standards, holding a sword, two insignia symbolizing that a mosque is a space not only for the connection between believers and God, but also believers and the political authority. Contrary to Ottoman belief in the Ottoman context, the sword was not a symbol of conquest, but rather the ruler. Still, both for those who advocated for the conversion of Hagia Sophia into a mosque and those who opposed this change, the first prayer, Friday prayer, signifies a reconquest. The conversion of the monument into a mosque has been on the political agenda of Islamist and conservative nationalists in Turkey at least since 1950s. The President Erdogan promised this conversion during his tenure as the first Islamist mayor of Istanbul in the 1990s. To some of his followers, Erdogan is the second conqueror of the city after Sultan Mehmet II. The belief is supported by the creative interpretation of Quranic passage, Surah 34, verse 15, Baldatun tayyibatun ve Rabbun gafurun, literal translated, a fair land and the indulgent Lord. In some popular Erdoganist interpretation, the verse alludes to Mr. Erdogan himself by way of his middle name, Tayyip, and the fair land is interpreted as referring to Istanbul. This interpretation was further strengthened by the fact that the numeric values, abjad, of the Arabic letters of Tayyip conveniently add up to 857, the year of the Ottoman conquest of Constantinople in the Islamic calendar. Given this promise, why did Erdogan wait for so many years to make this decision? What does he expect from this move for this, his domestic and foreign policy? Would this stop his diminishing popularity? Although this is clearly Erdogan's decision, why did he prefer that the political move be covered by a legal ruling by the Council of State instead of a presidential decree? There are important questions to be discussed. But my question here is how a conquest narrative, which is shared by those who oppose and support this decision, does not do justice to Hagia Sophia and its architecturally, spiritually, and emotionally charged history. I argue that both supporters and opponents of the decision in Turkey, in the United States, and Europe share a narrative of conquest based on Ottoman, Byzantine, Mosque, Church, Muslim, Christian, and secularism, Islamism binary. Those who oppose the decision often focus on the building as a Christian monument, which was converted into a mosque by the Ottomans as a result of conquest in 1453, into a museum by Atatürk in 1934 as a result of his secular policies, and now back into a mosque by an Islamist populist leader. This narrative emphasizes how a Christian monument survived in a Muslim context from the Ottoman Empire to secular Turkey and today's new regime. Those who are in favor of the decision, namely Islamists, conservatives, and nationalists in Turkey and some other Muslim countries, emphasizes a conquest narrative as well. For them, conquest legitimizes the conversion. It gives a new meaning to the building. It changed its ontological nature. Conquest was an eschatological event which caused a reborn of Hagia Sophia as a mosque. Therefore, for the advocates of the last decision, turning Hagia Sophia into a museum was a sinful act, but also a concession to the West, which has deeply hurt pious Muslims. It was a symbol of self-colonization on the part of the founders of modern Turkey. The recent decision also argues that because of Hagia Sophia was a part of Mehmed II's endowment, its status as a mosque could not possibly have been removed. This is effectively rendering the 1934 decision illegal or illegitimate. First of all, I would like to suggest that in 1934, the Turkish government's decision to turning the building into a museum was much more than a gesture to the West. For the founders of the Republic, this decision symbolized a new claim to Turkey's history. It was a matter of confidence rather than the concession. They thought that they were able to change the status of the most sacred building of the Ottoman Empire and transform it into a museum. This is a demonstration to demystify the Ottoman imperial and religio-political narrative. Therefore, the historical decision was a claim on the part of the new republic to establish a new relationship with the history of Istanbul and Anatolia beyond the Ottoman past. Of course, we should assume that the founders of the Turkish Republic equally we should not assume that the founders of the Turkish Republic equally embraced the entire historical heritage of their lands. They are primarily secular nationalists. Yet we should also see that whatever the real motivation, the 1934 decision has a universal value. As a result of this decision, Hagia Sophia was appreciated as one of the most important World Heritage sites in Turkey and in the world. In this regard, I would also like to challenge the argument that 1934 decision was given under the influence of European and American philanthropists and archaeologists, even though we still should appreciate the international collaboration for the restoration program for the Great Monument. It is also noteworthy that some secular intellectuals of the time opposed this decision on the basis that an active religious monument would better represent its history as a spiritual center than a museum. Secondly, the conquest narrative of both those who oppose and who support the current decision does not appreciate the complex history of Ottoman Hagia Sophia. It omits two crucial aspects of Ottoman's engagements with the monument. The first is the fact that Hagia Sophia took in a rich symbolism in Ottoman historical imagination. Yet for the Ottomans, Hagia Sophia was a symbol of conquest. But what is a conquest for the Ottomans? It did not simply mean erasing existing realities and building anew. It rather signified the incorporation of existing social, spiritual, and material realities into a new order, or constructing a new relationship between past and the present. The Ottomans transformed the lands they had conquered, but they were also transformed by their own conquests. The Ottomans changed Hagia Sophia, and Hagia Sophia changed them. They converted the building into a mosque and symbol of imperial power, and yet their entire notion of imperial architecture was shaped by Hagia Sophia. Therefore, we can say that Hagia Sophia shaped the Ottomans' way of seeing themselves and the history of their capital throughout centuries. It was almost a time tunnel linking them with the Romans and the Byzantine times. They studied its history from Greek sources. They connected it to the symbols of the Islamic traditions, which included Quranic and biblical prophets who came before Muhammad. Islamic art historians have shown that there was no widespread iconophobia in the pre-modern Islamic world. Generally, there are no human figures in the mosques, but we also know that the Ottomans were not uncomfortable in Hagia Sophia praying beneath the images of Jesus and Mary. In the 17th and 18th centuries, the monument continued to play important roles as a sacred political space. I think we can say that Hagia Sophia was the most important building in the Ottoman Empire, along with the Kaaba in Mecca and Dome of the Rock in Jerusalem until the end of the empire. Therefore, I argue that the conquest narrative, both by the opponents and the advocates of the last decision, did not give any justice to the complex history of Hagia Sophia in the Ottoman periods. Last of all, why Turkish right, not only Islamists, but also conservative, nationalists, and even some center-right liberals have been obsessed with this monument? Perhaps the epic speech of Necip Fazıl Kısakürek on December 29, 1965, at the Istanbul branch of National Student Union was a landmark for this agenda of the reconversion of the monument to a mosque for a broader spectrum of Turkey's right. Necip Fazıl, a controversial nationalist Islamist poet, who is probably the most influential figure for different tones of Turkish right, from ultranationalists to Islamists, is also frequently quoted by President Erdogan. His lecture, decorated with supremacist overtones, located Hagia Sophia issue as the core of the struggle between the East and the West, Islam and Christianity, conquest and victimization, Turkish benevolence and Greek wickedness, and finally between glorious imperial past and the corrupted Kemalist secularism. Needless to say, the splendor of Hagia Sophia as a mosque signifies the superiority of Ottoman and Islamic past, and museumization in 1934 for Kösekerek symbolized subordination, self-enslavement, and corruption. 1965 speech, Kösekerek concluded the address to hundreds of youth heralding the reopening of the monument as a mosque. He stirred up the audience, many of whom would be notable names in Turkish politics during the upcoming decades. Quote, "Youth, I cannot say it is today or tomorrow, but Hagia Sophia will be reopened as a mosque. Only those who have doubts about the Turks' survival on the soil can doubt whether it will be reopened," end quote. Since 1940s, Hagia Sophia, along with several other symbols, has united and mobilized different ideological positions in Turkey with a shared nostalgia, aspiration, and the call for a Turkish Islamist and imperial supremacist claims. For them, Hagia Sophia symbolized both Muslim and Turkish superiority, along with the conquest narrative. But surprisingly, it also signifies a victimhood, a top-down and autocratic, even colonial decision of the elites to the pious Muslims. This dual nature of Hagia Sophia cause has united different groups coming from diverse political and ideological orientations, from nationalists to Islamists, from Ottoman romantics to neoliberal conservatives. But why did Erdogan pick this very moment to use this, as my friend Yektan Türk Yılmaz called, super weapon, which is very valuable for a right-wing leader? For many, whatever the immediate motivation, this is a move to celebrate the end of Kemalist regime and its secular legacy. Even for some observers, this move can trigger further radical decisions against the old regime or the final victory of Erdogan, including the proclaiming the caliphate. I'm not a Kemalist romantic. I'm rather of creating a new democratic republic in Turkey. But in many ways, I should admit that Hagia Sophia's conversion to mosque signifies the end of the old regime with its gains and its shortfalls. Whatever this decision does not symbolize, however, this decision does not symbolize the creating a new regime. It was rather an imaginary or fictive restoration of the Ottoman past, and without any sincere engagement with its complex and multi-layered history. Overall, there are not many reasons to be optimistic, other than knowing that Hagia Sophia will endure, but those who claimed on it will not. Thank you.
Thank you, Lee. Our next speaker is Patricia Blessing, Assistant Professor of Islamic Art History in the Department of Art and Archaeology at Princeton University. Her book, Rebuilding Anatolia After the Mongol Conquest, Islamic Architecture in the Lands of Rum, 1240 to 1330, investigates the relationship between patronage, politics, and architectural style after the integration of the region into the Mongol Empire. Together with Rachel Goshgarian, she edited Architecture and Landscape in Medieval Anatolia, 1100 to 1500, and is presently working on a second monograph, Malleable Monuments, the Material Politics of Ottoman Architecture in the 15th Century. Patricia.
Thank you, Patrick, for the introduction. And I'd also like to thank the Cantor Center and Bissera for inviting me to speak today, and the Abbasi program in Islamic Studies at Stanford for hosting me as a visiting scholar this year. Hagia Sophia has a long history as an Ottoman monument, beginning with the conquest of Constantinople in 1453. Today, I will not focus on aspects like its Ottoman use and transformation, such as the covering up of its mosaics in the 17th and 18th centuries, but rather on how Hagia Sophia became a crucial model for Ottoman imperial architecture. Three structural aspects of the monument were central in this: the large central dome, the vast open space that opened underneath it, and the scaling half and quarter domes building up to the central one. While Hagia Sophia became a model for Ottoman buildings, it also continued its life under Ottoman rule itself, with numerous restorations and additions such as the minarets and 4 mausolea, including 3 built for Ottoman sultans. The model of Hagia Sophia was picked up for sultans' mosques, beginning with that of Mehmed II, built in the late 15th century, although the building that you see now is the result of reconstruction after earthquake damage in the 18th century. This interest in Hagia Sophia reached its highest point in the 16th century in the work of architect Sinan. He first designed such a monumental sultanic mosque with the Süleymaniye in Istanbul, where the model of the domes rising to its central peak was adopted. The mosque, however, was part of a much larger complex, which included schools, madrasas, fountains, as well as the mausolea for Süleyman the Magnificent and his wife Hürrem. The largest, in terms of its dome diameter, Ottoman Sultanic Mosque modeled on Hagia Sophia is the Selimiye in Edirne. Here, extensive substructures were built to raise the structure up, since the topography of Edirne did not have the kinds of hills that were used in Istanbul to make these buildings dominate the cityscape. Even though the diameter of the dome here is larger and nearly reaches that of Hagia Sophia, it is actually 10 meters less tall than both the model and that of the Süleymaniye Mosque. The building was integrated into a skyline for Edirne, where the Selimiye Mosque dominates the landscape, but also speaks to other earlier Ottoman buildings in the city. In that aspect, the Selimiye was also a response to the imperial and sacred topography that had been constructed in Istanbul since the times of Mehmed II. In the 15th century, this topography reached from Hagia Sophia to the Mosque of Mehmed II, all the way to the site of Eyüp. So, and you have the skyline that is, of course, famous, reaching from Hagia Sophia along the shores of the Golden Horn, that is filled in over time with the sultanic mosques for the Ottoman rulers up until Süleyman the Magnificent. His son and successor, Selim II, is the one who chooses Edirne as the site for his mosque. The site of Eyüp itself is part of this sacred and imperial topography. It is a shrine built on the reputed tomb of a companion of the Prophet Muhammad, Ayyub al-Ansari, who is believed to have been killed during the first Arab siege of Constantinople in the late 7th century. Its history starts with the miraculous discovery of the site during the reign of Mehmed II and goes across the time of Ottoman rule. As Gidem Kafescioğlu has examined in detail, the site takes on a crucial role, including in accession ceremonies for the Ottoman sultans. Here too, the architecture you see now was created in the 18th century, so we don't have the 15th century monument, but the site is very much built on that same premise. The model of Hagia Sophia continues to be used for Ottoman mosques in the 17th century, with the Sultan Ahmed Mosque, better known perhaps as the Blue Mosque, and the Yeni Cami on the shores of the Golden Horn. After that, we get a long hiatus in using the Hagia Sophia and Ottoman Sultanic Mosque model, even for the construction of monumental buildings. When we get to the early years of the Turkish Republic in the 1920s, we enter a period in which very few large mosques are built, in part as an expression of the secular nature of the new state. This changes, however, in the 1950s, tying into that same right-wing nationalist discourse that Ali just highlighted in his talk. And the first project is launched for not Istanbul, but Ankara which does not have any large sultanic mosques. A site is picked for the so-called Kocatepe Mosque that is located across inside of the monumental mausoleum that is built for Mustafa Kemal Atatürk. And so you have a very strong ideological tendency, as Bülent Batuman argues, for picking this site. However, the first design for the mosque that is approved is a modernist one. It has nothing to do with the historicizing mosque architecture, picking up on Ottoman models that we have perhaps become to expect. What happens, however, is that construction of Dalokai's design is interrupted by the military coup of 1960. After a hiatus of several years, it is decided to not build this monument, but a new building, which, although it is not completed until 1987, is actually a full-on copy-paste of an Ottoman Sultanic mosque, and particularly strongly refers to the Süleymaniye. When this building is completed, and even as its design is approved, it comes to a shock for the architectural community of Turkey. As Bülent Batuman suggests, the mimicry involved in it, that's in part self-orientalizing and in part nostalgic, is a complete switch away from modernist, very diverse mosque architectures that had been built over several decades before this. However, this choice becomes hugely popular, and particularly beginning in the 1990s, and more strongly so under the AKP government led by now President Erdogan, this kind of mosque architecture becomes the architectural embodiment of political Islam. The most recent result of this style is the Jamlija Mosque in Istanbul, just opened last year, which is a monumental building that can accommodate thousands and thousands of worshippers. Buildings like this have been built across Turkey over the last decades. They've also been built with Turkish support in other parts of the world. And they are an expression of both the Turkish leadership over the Muslim world that Erdogan has been striving to achieve, although much less successfully in the last few years than perhaps earlier on in his tenure. In this architecture, the Ottoman past is glorified, and these larger and larger mosques also signify a dominance of Sunni Islam. This dominance is not just asserted over non-Muslim communities, an aspect that has often been mentioned in connection to the conversion of Hagia Sophia from museum to mosque, but also over the larger Alevi community. So new constructions, as well as the transformation of Hagia Sophia from museum back to mosque, are part of the architectural politics of the Turkish government and of an ideological political Islam.
Thank you so much, Patricia. I'm going to keep moving right along here on to our next speaker, who is Anna Bigelow, Associate Professor of Islamic Studies in the Department of Religious Studies here at Stanford. She received her MA from Columbia and PhD in Religious Studies from UC Santa Barbara with a focus on South Asian Islam. Her book, Sharing the Sacred, Practicing Pluralism in Muslim North India, is a study of Muslim majority community in Indian Punjab and the shared sacred and civic spaces in that community. Bigelow's current projects include a comparative study of shared sacred sites in India and Turkey, and an edited volume on material objects in Islamic cultures.
Great, thank you so much. Thank you, Patrick and Bisara, for organizing, and to all the participants. It's been really a treat to hear everybody's perspectives. Coming from religious studies, it's always interesting to hear how religious spaces are read and construed through other disciplines. So that's been helpful and intriguing for me. So the opening of the Hagia Sophia as a mosque in July 2020 is really just the latest example, as we've heard already today, of how Recep Tayyip Erdogan and his allies are redefining Turkey's constitutional secularism to reflect their conservative religious sensibilities and to assert their national sovereignty. We've heard from Ali earlier about how this has a much deeper history as well, and I think that provides a really helpful background for what I wanted to discuss. But for religious studies, the mosqueification, if you will, of the Hagia Sophia also brings into sharp relief the way that sites held sacred by multiple communities are productive venues for promoting visions of the nation and mobilizing citizens to respond accordingly. It leads us to ask, why are sacred sites so central in the public debates about the nature of this constitutionally secular polity? And further, what are the strategies by which a regime not only claims the right to declare the Hagia Sophia a mosque, but also how they validate it among the wider public? So every transition, even the construction of the building itself, has been a part of religio-political projects that framed the rightful rulers as true and proper custodians of the Hagia Sophia. This leads to our question about why monuments are so central in the process of claiming a national identity. Monumental spaces are not merely stages upon which sovereign power is performed. They are actants themselves, enabling and resisting human uses and imaginaries. As Sally Permy has argued, quote, "The things towards which we orient ourselves shape our perceptions of the environments we inhabit and the possibilities available to us." So sacred spaces are acting upon us even as we act upon them. So monuments, to be sure, of course, as many have written, perform and symbolize power. They may offer glimpses of the original intent of their creators, but they also shape and are shaped by the social systems that continually produce, perform, inherit, reconfigure, control them. And so while Henri Lefebvre rightly argued that there's a power feedback loop between monuments and political regimes by which they're created and claimed, that feedback loop can be and often has been disrupted. And so controlling the meaning of a monument is always unfolding and often incomplete. And it takes a lot of work to claim a contested monument. The argument for the mosque reversion was built incrementally and deliberately over time, and we heard a fantastic background to that narrative earlier. Religio-political agents have tested the proverbial waters in various ways in recent times, through advocating for pilgrimage to the site, prayer at or near the site, the mosqueification of other Hagia Sophia church mosques / museums in Turkey. All the time experimenting with the popularity and the palatability of these various strategies. So these efforts involve multiple layers: the use of judicial and legislative processes, the production of social memory through ritualization and narrativization, countering minority theological claims with majority apologetics, and appealing to pride, patriotism, and populism. Promoting majoritarian worship in shared spaces is a way of performing and defining the nation itself by mobilizing and moving bodies, by exerting efforts to control the interpretive possibilities available to the populace. Though, of course, local Christians are not a real political or demographic threat to the regime, real and perceived anti-Christian discrimination does continue to undermine multilateral relations for Turkey, with NATO, with the EU, with UN, with the US to some degree, or to varying degrees. It also sends a message to other religious and ethnic minorities in the state, signaling that if the regime can do this to the most internationally famous and beloved site in the country, they can act with impunity in pretty much any case they choose. So I'll just breeze through this part. Of course, we know that Turkey's constitution has provisions for the freedom of religion, but also contains a strong assertion of the rights of the republic to ensure the indivisible integrity of the state. And this has functionally meant near total control of religion by the state. The Turkish form of secularism is not identical to the US version, but in both societies, just by way of comparison, we can see that in the last decades in particular, a sector of the majority religious community has coalesced around perceived grievance, discrimination, and anti-religious policies. And these perceptions, real and not real, have been very productive in terms of mobilizing politically coherent and sustained action from these sectors of society. So one element in AKP's process of claiming the nation for majoritarian religious politics is through the redefinition of secularism itself to mean rejecting enmity towards religion, which is already a somewhat grievance-oriented reading of the constitutional provisions and framing attitudes and practices which disturb pious people as anti-democratic and as acting in contradiction of human rights. So deploying this internationalist language of rights in service of this changing concepts. However, the strategies we're most concerned with today are those involving sacred space. One of these strategies involves these test cases. In Turkey, this has meant conversion of other church mosques that had become museums or become sort of inactive into active mosques. Though domestic and international objection has been raised following some of these actions, no substantial negative consequences to the government has really ensued. However, this is not true in case of the buildings themselves, which have received some negative consequences. As Pinar Aykaç has argued, the conversions have, quote, vandalized the buildings by hasty, unqualified, and even rudimentary restorations with extensive reconstructions. Another experiment has been the introduction of a prayer space that was first introduced in 1980 very briefly and then reopened in 1991. This space is not accessible to or from the museum, but it's clearly a project that's enjoyed enormous state support. It's entered under the minaret towards closest to the Topkapi Palace, and basically is the passageway through which the Sultan would have entered into the main body of the Hagia Sophia, and the egress from this chamber is onto the platform, leads you to the platform from which the Sultan would pray. It's understood that this is a fulfillment of a waqf. Then, as Ali was talking about, this is clearly something that is sort of reclaiming the enduring authority of endowment law, that these are endowments in perpetuity and then therefore cannot be disrupted. Obviously, in more recent times, this project has received a lot more state support, including extensive renovations since about the mid-2010s. This has really been transformed with a new and a very intricate minbar and mihrab. The imam's office here to the right in this image has a chamber with a portion of the kiswa, the cloth covering that goes over the Kaaba in Mecca, that is distributed by the Saudi government to allies and supporters, and as sort of a mark of authority. Not everybody gets a piece of the kiswa, to say the very least. It proceeds in a sort of series of awkwardly spaced rooms that, as you can see by the direction of the prayer lines on the carpet, are not very effectively oriented, just as the main prayer space is not very typically oriented in the direction of Mecca. But the last chamber, right before entering into the main body of the building, has been restored in the late 2010s to have images of Mecca and Medina, which the Sultan could have contemplated as he waited to, or as he passed through to go to prayer. The Ottoman Sultan, though being the custodian at many stages of Mecca and Medina, was often not able to go, or almost never could go to Mecca and Medina himself as a matter of prayer. So this is one of the other strategic experiments, but we can see others where we see the growth of popularity of public rituals, such as occasional efforts by individuals to pray inside the Hagia Sophia, and increasingly spectacular crowds praying outside, especially on the anniversary of the conquest, all expressions of majoritarian grievance that also serve to demonstrate the strength and commitment of those desiring the Hagia Sophia to be an active mosque again. There's also occasionally been exhibitions and performances within the space that are used as signs of what the site should really be. There are massive online petitions as well. And since the conversion, the government has been at pains to point out that over 1.5 million or so people have come to pray at the Hagia Sophia. So to bolster the claim that this is the popular will is being enacted here. Other experiments in mosqueification come from government officials on various occasions. One such moment, it was the affective, theological, and legalistic claims made by Bülent Arınç in a speech at the Hagia Sophia at the opening of a textile museum in the complex in 2013, when he said that the building itself was sad. You were looking at a sad Hagia Sophia now, towards the end of this quotation, in its current non-mosque state. and that as a nation of laws, Turkey must abide by laws, and that by law, a mosque could not be used for other purposes than as a mosque. It's a somewhat tautological argument, to be sure, but it also really deftly interweaves this multi-layered claim. And publicly, at least, often and after this declaration by Orange, Erdogan himself would usually respond to these calls for the opening of Hagia Sophia by saying, first, we should fill Sultan Ahmet, the blue mosque across the plaza, which was often not overfull during times of prayer. And so he often would deflect this. So it's really only recently that he wholeheartedly came behind this, though, as Ali pointed out, this has been an inconsistent position on his part. And so then after the conversion, Erdogan and the AKP continue to generate content that makes their case to audiences both foreign and domestic. The shape of these arguments reveal both their own strategies in authenticating their claims and also their sense of what the most effective and affective counter-arguments that they must address might be. In his 25-minute address to the nation, Erdogan used internationalist language of sovereignty in particular that resonates with majoritarian grievance, legalistic language that speaks to the past and present of the law of religious endowments or waqf, emotive language that drew on the laments of famous poets and artists, as Ali also referenced, and theological language that framed the mosque conversion in soteriological terms. This is essentially a salvation, an issue of national salvation, as well as actual salvation. He also characterized the objections to the conversion as Islamophobic and xenophobic, which is always an argument that will find an audience. The AKP Foreign Affairs Division then reinforced Erdogan's message with a recently published brochure, in Turkish and in English, that justifies the conversion on multiple fronts. And I won't go through all of these here in the interest of time, but all these arguments basically anticipate the scope of global critique and try to make claims that would counter those arguments. In particular, their pages 12 to 21 are examples of preserved churches, and to show that the government is not eradicating religious sites that are important to Christians. But it only mentions these Christian sites and only these, which is obviously a selective move in its reading. They also justify this again through the will of the people, that there was this great demand of people of Turkey that the building regain its identity as a mosque. And this cites a 6,000 person survey for which no methodology is given, which is always an alarm for social scientists, and that in this 78.6% of those responding believed it should be a mosque. So it's a very multi-layered and clear argument that draws on a whole host of issues. So to wrap up, it's still too early to see if these actions will have a major effect on the AKP's standing with the Turkish public, given the poor economy and other domestic challenges. Some survey data shows eroding support for Erdogan. The last elections had included setbacks for him in regional elections. And there's no real effect as far as that data, which is available thus far, says about what the effect of this reversion to a mosque might have on the electoral prospects for the party. Nonetheless, having explicitly rejected the authority of internationalist bodies like UNESCO to challenge the move, it's unlikely that anything other than electoral defeat would change the situation. Though condemnations have certainly rolled in from many directions, including a tepidly worded discouragement from Secretary of State Mike Pompeo on July 1st in anticipation of the change. Trump, who tweets on everything, has not done so on this issue. So I think I'll just wrap up there and pass the mic.
Anna, thank you very much. We are going to move to our next speaker, and this is Christina Maranzi, professor of medieval Armenian art and architecture. Her books have explored the historiography of the field, engaged some of the major monuments like Svartnots and Ani, and offered a broad-based, accessible introduction to Armenian art and architecture. And I give the word to Christina.
Thank you so much, Bisera. Thank you, Patrick, for organizing this wonderful event and for last week's as well. So I am an outlier in this group. I'm a historian of medieval Armenian art and architecture. And for many years, I have worked on the monuments straddling the closed international border between the republics of Armenia and Turkey. Modern Turkey is home to thousands of Armenian churches and monasteries, which are traces of the Armenian homeland lost with the genocide of 1915 to 1922. Many people have written eloquently about this issue, among them Hegnar Wattenpach. In a recent op-ed about the conversion of Hagia Sophia, Wattenpach expressed concerns about how this set a precedent for the fate of Christian churches farther to the east. The conversion of Hagia Sophia has raised questions about the efficacy and the role of heritage bodies like UNESCO and ICOMOS, and about what they can and ought to do. And in this connection, Bisera and Patrick have asked me to speak about my work with the World Monuments Fund, the private nonprofit organization based in New York, as well as about the possibilities and challenges in managing Christian heritage in the modern day Turkish Republic. So in my short time, I will share with you some of what I've learned on the ground, and also give you a sense of what have become, for me, guiding principles in my work, in hopes that they may provide a useful perspective on Hagia Sophia. And I'll try to keep this brief. So my involvement with the World Monuments Fund began with the Church of Meren, a remarkable inscribed, sculpted, and frescoed Armenian church dating to the 7th century. Meren is situated in a closed and militarized border zone just a few kilometers from the Republic of Armenia. In 2013, I discovered that Meren was in much worse condition than I thought. A few years before, the south facade of the church had completely collapsed. My study photographs, which were from the early 2000s, showed that the southwest corner of the church had fallen down, but the newer internet photographs showed the total collapse of this wall. In February 2013, I mobilized a campaign to raise awareness of Meren. Having contacted UNESCO with no response, I emailed the World Monuments Fund. I sought to get Meren on the World Monuments Fund watch, self-described as a global program launched to identify imperiled cultural heritage sites and direct financial and technical support for their preservation. The watch list is specifically targeted to save at-risk monuments through a short, focused intervention. For example, Hagia Sophia was on the inaugural watch in 1996, and then again in 1998 in response to water damage caused by cracks in the roof and by rising groundwater levels. Meren was successfully listed for the years 2014 to 2017. Meren is not as structurally complex as the Hagia Sophia, but work at the site presented a remarkable set of challenges. The 2015 site visit required the combined permission of the Ministries of the Interior, the Ministry of Culture and Tourism, and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Permits were all obtained with the stewardship of the World Monuments Fund, who also arranged grants from the State Department, and more particularly the US Ambassador's Fund for Cultural Preservation, and from the US Embassy in Ankara. The project was endorsed and supported throughout by Osman Kavala, longtime friend and associate. I owe him a great debt of thanks for mobilizing his NGO, Anadolu Kultur, in support of this project, among many others. The Meren team included a seismologist, restoration architects, historians, engineers, diplomats, and administrators from all over the world. This team was tasked with assessing the condition of the church, the site, and its archaeology, as well as gauging community interest, access, and security. We did visual inspection and documentation, including 3D laser scanning. The team also recommended emergency and long-term measures to be carried out to prevent future failure. While the laser scanning was done successfully, the emergency measures were not implemented during the watch list's prescribed 3-year window, so the building remains at risk. In 2015, there were cracks separating the north wall from the structure, and a friend who visited Meren last month told me that these cracks are widening further. There is thus urgent work to be done and more help to be sought. I've also collaborated with the World Monuments Fund at Ani, the ruined medieval city and royal Armenian capital, inscribed in 2016 onto UNESCO's World Heritage List. World Monuments Fund has worked at Ani since 1996, when the site was first placed on the watch list. Since then, they have overseen many projects there. Recent restorations have focused on two monuments, the cathedral, which you see in the distance, and the church of Sir Purge, or the Savior. Sir Purge, today a strangely picturesque ruin, is a 19-sided stone masonry building with sculpture, inscriptions, and interior frescoes, now exposed to the elements, thus presenting an intensely complex restoration project. It has now been stabilized with buttresses. Scaffolding allows for access up to the dome and protects workers against rockfall. Monitoring devices gauge its condition and movement, and fragments of carved stone have been inventoried and sheltered from the elements. Simultaneously with this project was another, Armenian Context, funded by the Norwegian Embassy in Turkey. This emerged out of talks between ICOMOS Armenia and the Norwegian Institute for Cultural Heritage Research, NICU, then directed by Karsten Paludan-Müller. World Monuments Fund and Anadolu Kultur also participated in Armenian Context, as did Koç University's RCAC, now ANAMED. This collaboration resulted in a visit to Ani and its vicinity in 2013 with a group of international experts. We assessed 21 sites in the region, from churches completely erased from the landscape, churches in various states of collapse, and most pertinently, a church converted to a mosque. We used a risk assessment matrix to rate monuments based on the highest priority for intervention. I could name many ongoing projects and organizations that seek to protect and raise awareness of Armenian heritage in Turkey. Anadolu Kultur, the Hrant Dink Association, Koç University's ANAMED, and many others. Anadolu Kultur is developing a mobile application for use at Ani. Downloaded to your phone, it will give a sense of the site in detail with inscription translations, technical and historical information, and various routes through the city, depending on the time you have. So to conclude, I'd just like to share with you a few points I've learned in working on heritage with the World Monuments Fund. As many have observed in this the last session and this one, much has changed in the politics and foreign policies of both Turkey and the US in the past 5 or 6 years. Garo Paylan's op-ed just yesterday in the New York Times described poignantly the authoritarian turn in Turkey. For almost 3 years, Osman Kavala has been unjustly imprisoned for crimes of which he is innocent. And now Azerbaijan has waged war on the Republic of Nagorno-Karabakh, and Turkey has intervened on the former's behalf. It is difficult not to look back without a great sense of loss and worry for the future. Nevertheless, it is important to remain optimistic. We all know how much heritage is tied up with politics and how interests and pressures of the most powerful often determine the fate of the vulnerable. Sometimes it seems as though heritage is part of an inexorable tectonic shift in elite power. What I've found, however, is that things are less predictable than one might think. Conditions change fast, possibilities open, and the optics of heritage can be very different from what is happening on the ground. In the 1990s, the idea of work at Maranzi seemed impossible. In the early 2000s, it took place. Second point, it's important to devise short-term strategic and results-based solutions. For example, what could be achieved at Hagia Sophia next year? What kinds of events, projects, and proposals might pave the way towards long-term goals? What could be the terms of negotiation? Professor Zeynep Ahunbey last time discussed ongoing exterior work at Hagia Sophia, as well as the possibility of visiting the gallery and its mosaics. How might this be leveraged into more? Third point, matters of heritage are intensely complex and confusing, often involving competing interests and ambitions of diverse stakeholders. In the midst of what can seem both agonistic and agonizing, I've learned to train my sights on the long-term health, that is the structural and physical integrity of the monuments. Hagia Sophia, like Maranzi and Ani, and indeed any other cultural monument, exists not just for us, but for our children, our students, and future generations. Remembering this can assist in deciding on the best short-term strategies, which might simply be to safeguard the building until things change. Fourth point, heritage must go hand in hand with education. Education must go hand in hand with scholarship, and that is where our historians come in. Hagia Sophia is a famous building. Other beautiful, important buildings are not famous. The more the public knows, the more they will care. If the Julfa Cemetery in Nakhchivan were better known, there might have been a greater international response to its complete erasure by Azerbaijani authorities. The same can be said about the Razan-Chitsots Cathedral in Artsakh, bombed by Azeri forces on October 8th. A public forum such as this is thus of the utmost importance. Not only does it give experts a chance to share ideas and pool information, but it serves to teach the value of historical monuments, ultimately producing better chances for their protection. Thank you.
Christina, thank you for this wonderful talk that brings the legacy of Osman Kavala and his recognition of how important education is, that it is through education, through a better understanding of history, that some of these conflicts could be overcome. And I will take this as a lead. This was a comment that he made in the reception of his recent award, the Ding Award, where he said that a new generation that could have been friends under different conditions are now in a violent opposition. So I will turn to our next speaker, Ajetta Melkiran. She's a phenomenon, a novelist, a journalist, a political commentator. Her nonfiction books confront many of Turkey's taboos, like the Armenian genocide in her book, Deep Mounting, Across the Turkish-Armenian Divide, published in 2010, a sobering presentation of the continual failure to protect human rights and to build an equitable society in Turkey. The book is called Turkey, the Insane and the Melancholy, published in 2015, and the powerful wake-up call to all humanity in her recent book, How to Lose a Country, The 7 Steps from Democracy to Dictatorship, 2019. She's also a very successful fiction novelist, but I wanted to feature here in this presentation her work on nonfiction. So, Ajetta, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Bisera, and thank you for your very, very kind words. Thank you all for your brilliant, amazing presentations. I have been, it has been a delight, a true delight to listen to all of you. To have a writer or a journalist in such an academic panel is always a nuisance. And I am here only because Bisera years ago blew up, burst a balloon in Hagia Sophia. And I didn't know about this. For those who don't know about the incident, Bisera bursting or blowing up a balloon in Hagia Sophia, this is what happened on 4th of November in 2016. There was a mesmerizing concert by Cappella Romana, a renowned choir. The concert was in Stanford University Concert Hall. And the title of the concert was Hagia Sophia Reimagined. And the audience listened to Byzantine chants and as they were heard in Middle Ages in Hagia Sophia. The choir's voice was filtered through an algorithm created by Stanford's Center for Computer Research in Music and Acoustics. The scientists, including Bisera, went to Hagia Sophia and recorded several sounds to understand how the spectacular acoustics of the building was operating, and then applied the same acoustic process to the music of choir. So when Hagia Sophia was reopened as a mosque, Le Monde from France asked me to write a piece about it. And being a former journalist, political commentator, and a writer, as Bisera told, I had to gather most of the things you've been talking about to make a short piece which ordinary people who does not know anything about Turkey, the complex issue of Turkey, and who does not, who did not really hear about Hagia Sophia, I wrote a short piece. And in that piece, I tried to explain what Christina actually talked about a few minutes ago, that this building actually do not belong to us, neither to us nor to AKP or Recep Tayyip Erdogan, because it is striking me it is very striking to listen to all of you, because all the fuss created around Hagia Sophia today is created by those people who do not know a single thing that we are here, I am listening today, and you were talking about. And all these populist leaders, they behave with a certain calculated ignorance and vulgarity, and somehow it always works. And Hagia Sophia is one of the biggest and most important victims of this calculated ignorance and vulgarity. On the day of the concert in Stanford, Istanbul, the city where Hagia Sophia is, was too noisy with sounds of jingoism and this calculated ignorance and vulgarity. So such a work of finesse went completely unheard. It was only a few months after the coup attempt, 15th of July in 2016, and amidst the noise, many were leaving the country silently, one of them being me. They were the ones who surrendered to the fact that only the voices of vulgarity and violence would reign in Turkey. On the night of the coup attempt, the Selah, the special prayer that is performed during the death, after the death, called from 90,000 mosques. We're making it clear that Turkey, they know, wouldn't be anymore. Hagia Sophia was opened, I think so far nobody mentioned this, Hagia Sophia was opened as a mosque on the 24th of July, the day of Lausanne Treaty that was signed in 1923. The treaty is considered as the founding document of Republic of Turkey in international political history. Therefore, for those who had a long-lasting discomfort with laicite, turning Hagia Sophia to a mosque on such an anniversary had a strong symbolism. But just in case for those who do not see the symbolism, Erdogan's regime and its supporters rubbed it in our faces. The cries of Allahu Akbar in the supposedly secular parliament by the government MPs and the statements from Erdogan supporters, such as "the stone man is melting," a reference to Atatürk statues, made it all clear that the founding of Erdogan's Turkey was finally completed. So Hagia Sophia, as we all know, and as many of you told already, was the sealing of the fact that Turkey was conquered again. Turkey is an interesting country, and you know this already. I mean, like the panelists already know this. We have a very interesting and almost schizophrenic relation to our past. When we were growing up, there was this one map in our classrooms, and the map was always the same. There was this Western countries, Balkans and so on, and there were the Middle Eastern countries and USSR, then, I am that old, and USSR and the Middle Eastern countries were grayish yellow, whereas the Balkans and the European countries were colorful, lively, detailed, with city names and the rivers and everything. Turkey was obviously in the middle as the biggest country. So it was an ideological presentation, of course, a representation. The map was telling us, go west, look at west, everything is there, life is there. In this grayish, yellowish part of the world, Middle East and USSR, there's nothing happening. Dirty Arabs and camels are wandering around that, so there's nothing to see there. So focus on west. We were both, we were constantly sucked in between these two things, our relation to East and our ideological target as the West. And our relation to our history was not completely different than this. It was also an existential vacuum. Ottomans were magnificent, but also corrupted. So we were the descendants of them, but we were rejecting them. So this tension was very alive, and time to time it was invigorated with political intentions, obviously. So Hagia Sophia is obviously part of this, but you know, there is a historic importance of the matter, but also when Hagia Sophia was reopened as a mosque, there was an international climate, and there was a quite complicated situation, as it is today, in terms of Turkish foreign politics. So Hagia Sophia, reopening Hagia Sophia as a mosque came as the biggest political distraction that Erdogan has used so far. While everyone was busy with the museum mosque dispute, a list of massive matters became invisible. Some of them were natural gas and oil drilling in South Mediterranean, and the problems it created with Greece, establishing a multiple bar system for lawyers that will ruin the already damaged justice system, many high profile political prisoners, one of them being Osman Kavala. And you know, there were several other things ongoing, like Syria situation, and you know, constant problems with Russia and so on. So the cathedral was used as a distraction, obviously, but also it was a symbol of Erdogan making it sure for the rest of the world that now Turkey is almost an Islamic republic, or took a very big step towards that. Those who followed his masterful distraction politics were already tedious with such moves. However, his devotees at the moment are, you know, they were all busy with witch hunting of those who try to express the fact that the sovereignty of a country cannot monopolize the shared inheritance of humanity. The regime spin doctors went far enough to say that this is a milestone towards Al-Aqsa. The political Islamist aspirations that Erdogan supporters call the cause were totally unleashed, and amplified noise of the cause did not anymore let any other voice of finesse to be heard, let alone be amplified, neither in Hagia Sophia or elsewhere. Having said this, what Becerra and the scientists from Stanford did in Hagia Sophia, recording the acoustic process in the building, inspired me a lot, and that's why I wrote about it in Le Monde, because Hagia Sophia has been there and will be there probably, and AKP, Erdogan, and his supporters, all the fuss they're creating will be another thing that is just passing by, almost leaving no mark on the building, or at least I'm hoping so. I'm not living in Turkey anymore. Since 2016, I'm living in Zagreb. And one of the reasons is this vulgarity and calculated ignorance, and how violent it can get. I have seen how violent it can get, and it did. And Osman Kavala is a friend of mine. So today, talking about how to protect Hagia Sophia also means a lot to me in terms of, you know, because I'm thinking it also applies to how are we supposed to protect Osman Kavala, who's been in prison since 3 years now. But I do think that time is a patient matter. It can wait long enough for those who do not know any other language than shouting to eventually lose their voices. And I am expecting and I'm hoping that this too much shouting, this noise, will exhaust the owners of those voices, and these voices will be soon consumed. I am hoping, and I also know it from history, that it happens at the end. So what Becerra and the Stanford guys and the a cappella choir, the choir did, showed me actually that the sound can travel in time as well, not only space, but also in time. So what we are all trying to do, Osman, all those people who are trying to save these places, we are trying to make our voices travel in time so our generation will not be embarrassed before our children. And we are trying to keep a memory alive. We are like the guardians of a memory. When Christina was talking about Cathedral of Maranzi and Ani, I remembered my reportage, my interviews around those places. It is rather tragically funny, I would say, because when you ask the villagers around old Armenian churches, when you ask about the church or monuments, they always say the same thing. They say, oh, they're from prehistoric times. And it is very understandable for those who know Turkish history, because the year 1923, the foundation of Turkish Republic, is year zero. So before year zero, it is prehistoric times. And then when you dig even more, when you dig deeper and you keep on asking questions, they finally mention the name of Armenians. And then when you ask them, so where are they now? And they answer, they went. And you ask, where did they go? And they always show a bridge or a road, and they say, they went from here. And as if there is no end of that road, and there was no time before 1923, their eyes go blank and their minds go into this strange, emptiness, so to speak. And we are all doing these things because we don't want such a big monument like Hagia Sophia to go into that void, not to be lost in that void of memory. And I thank you all. You are doing something amazing, and I am very honored to be among you, to be one of the voices. But we are going through some very hard times. We are trying to save human lives, and there are people who are trying to save buildings and trees and the sea and the air and so on. So there's a lot to protect, and sometimes one does not know where to start. But I think Hagia Sophia is a good place to start, because when Becerra made her presentation in the first panel, she said, and I didn't know that, by the way, Sofia meant wisdom. So I think we will all have to protect the wisdom in these times of political and moral insanity. And Hagia Sophia can be the symbol of it, I think. Deserves to be the symbol of it. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Ajetta. Now the floor is open for all the panelists to ask each other questions. And I will start to get us warmed up to the discussion. And I would like to turn to the importance of the short-term goals for the preservation of a monument, and also the much larger idea about knowledge of history, education, and teaching the complexity of monuments and the complexity of such sites on which identities are built. So I'd like to turn to all the speakers to hear, maybe starting with the two art historians, Christina Maranzi and Patricia Blessings. Patricia Blessing, what are the what short-term steps they see? And maybe Patricia, I'll start with you because Christina outlined them quite clearly. Go ahead.
Well, for Hagia Sophia specifically, I mean, one aspect of the transformation from museum to mosque that we've been seeing seems to be that any sort of information about the history of the building is now absent from the site. So I haven't seen it myself. I haven't been to Hagia Sophia since the transformation. But to my sense, these two things don't have to be mutually exclusive, right? There would be, as Ali and I wrote in an essay, there would be ways of quite inobtrusively introducing historical information about the building, its Byzantine history, its use as a church, its Ottoman history, into the building. The fact that it is a mosque doesn't mean that there can't be any information panel, or there could even be an audio guide where you could even have some of the soundscapes of Hagia Sophia over the past. But I mean, that's something where I do think the fact that the administration of the building was moved from the Ministry of Tourism and Culture to Religious Affairs plays a huge role in that. The Ministry of Culture is where these kind of things are developed, and Religious Affairs so far has not demonstrated any kind of interest in them for any of the sites that they've been given in the last few years, including several of the ones that we saw in Anna's presentation.
I'm going to jump in very quickly, because in the earlier conversation with our part one panelists, it became clear that the transition is still very uncertain, that the Ministry of Culture and Tourism is still responsible for the conservation of the building. The use of the building is what will be part of Dianet's Institution for Pious Organizations' responsibility. In other words, it's quite unclear how the stewardship of the building will continue in the future years. And I think all the more reason, in a sense, for the complexity of our voices to be heard at many different fora. I would like to bring in one other aspect that speaks to this complex approach to history. We heard from Patricia's talk today about the importance of Hagia Sophia in shaping Ottoman identity, and the fact that it is austerity and extimacy that is at the center of identity. And this was also in Ali's talk today, when he spoke about the fact that the recent manipulation with the memory of the past is reductivist and really misses the multiple layers of interaction between Ottoman, Byzantine, and Roman that was part in this creative approach to integrating the legacy of Hagia Sophia in Ottoman identity. So to move to the point, what I would like to introduce to our larger audience is that when Mehmed II transformed the church into a mosque, he kept the mosaics and he created Quranic glosses. This is in the work of Gurun Najiboglu. Quranic glosses that were written on the mihrab that spoke to and amplified the message of the image of the Virgin and Child in the apse. And the reason I want to bring this detail is because it relates to what Christina Maranzi and Ajetta Melkiran were speaking about. This is the legacy of humanity. It's not just our generation, but the generation, our children and the children of our children. And what Mehmed II did, he chose quote from the Surah of Al-Imran. This is Surah 3, verse 37, which has the word mihrab in it. And it has a series of words that are based on the Arabic root of Kabbalah that relates to embrace, to a kiss, and to nourishing. And these are the words that were underneath, in a sense, the apse that relate to the image of the Virgin and Child. It's about care. It's about stewardship. It's about protection and nourishment. And so he said, so her, the Lord, accepted her with good acceptance. He made her grow in good manner and put her under the care of Zachariah. Every time he entered the mihrab to visit her, he found her supplied with sustenance. He said, "O Miriam, Mary, from where have you got this?" And she said, "This is from Allah. Verily, Allah provides sustenance to whom he wills without limit." And I would just, end of quotes. This is the end of the surah that is, the verse that is quoted in the mihrab, which takes on the image of the Virgin and Child in the apse and puts it into a larger context of protection. It's a power that values life and nourishes that life. This is the message that is kept, and this is the message that is lost today in the populist intervention in Hagia Sophia.
Are we going to make a discussion, or
yes,
you're going to...
Go ahead.
I have a question. When Bigelow, in her perfect presentation, there was a subtitle claiming contested sacred site, which reminded me a recent incident that happened in Hagia Sophia after it was converted to mosque. There was an American actress, I don't remember her name. Anyway, she visited Hagia Sophia, and her visit became a big thing, especially in the AKP supporting media, because she wasn't wearing a bra. Well, she wasn't naked, but there wasn't a bra, obviously. And then, as you know, it's not only a mosque now, but it is also promised to be preserved as a whatever, a monument. So obviously this woman, with or without bra, had the right to be in that space. But then the populist intervention, as you call it, by utilizing not only religion, but also conservative views, is claiming this space on daily basis, not only on legal basis, not only in this Da Vinci Code fantasy world, like Ali has already put very nicely. So I was wondering if there is intention among the art historians, or anybody who is truly interested in this building and preserving this building, do these people have any intention to claim the space physically in coming days? Because I am from Turkey. This is quite close to my heart, this whole issue. It's not only Hagia Sophia, but also claiming Turkey, because I feel like I lost my country, so I want to claim it as well. And Hagia Sophia is an important part of it. So I do believe that physical claiming is important as well. So I was wondering if there is any organization or any intention to organize to claim this space physically, and to show to Turkish people and to the rest of the world that this is not only a mosque, but it is Hagia Sophia. And this question also goes to Christina, because she's more, I think, following the issue on daily basis.
I'm going to let Anna speak, because I think she will get me started, but she will speak about maybe more about religious spaces and their use, and that might be useful. Maybe she won't. I don't know. I'm going to let her go though.
At this point, I don't know of any network of people trying to figure out ways to claim the space for other possible usages in any sort of public demonstrations. I don't know how possible that would be in the current landscape without incurring major backlash and certainly possibly violence as well. But I mean, it's clear to see how the incremental strategy of claiming the space by praying outside of it and having these moments happen was a way of testing the, what was the, how far can we go at various stages in history. And you saw, even before the conversion, there was an actress model who, appeared naked in the Hagia Sophia as a kind of public protest. And that was, kind of or just maybe to get on the news. It's hard to know in some of these cases whether it's just an effort to make a statement of some kind rather than anything specifically about how this should be a certain type of space or not. I think Patricia's point about the ways in which one could actually technically make the space multiply available to its various interlocutors, whether museumification is necessary to that process or not, is one that's very interesting, because it's pretty clear that museumification does not eliminate these multiple attachments and desires at all. It doesn't work in Israel, Palestine. It doesn't work in India. It hasn't worked anywhere in cases where people have tried to obviate conflict through museums. That, at least not inherently. I mean, there are cases where it happens less conflictually than others. And just briefly back to what Bissara was mentioning, that passage from the Quran that's over the mihrab is over many, many mihrabs. It is not merely the one at Hagia Sophia in relation to the Virgin Mary in the dome, but rather this is because the word mihrab appears in that passage. It is one of the more popular passages to be used in the calligraphy, which it's also worth remembering would not have been legible to a sizable proportion of the visitors to the site. Even people who had the Arabic or could read the script cannot often read that kind of calligraphy very effectively. So it's a little bit hard to gauge the actual conceptual relevance of your reading of that passage and what it might signify. It's almost impossible to say whether that would have spoken to any visitor, Muslim or non-Muslim, in that particular reading. So I just wanted to touch back on that. But Christina, you may have some thoughts on the.
Well, actually, Anna, what you said, and then also maybe responding to Ajetta, thinking about sort of laying claim to spaces in different ways. You reminded me of Akdamar and the Armenian liturgy that was said in Akdamar. I think it was 2015, which was, got a lot of publicity, but it was very controversial and was seen as a kind of propaganda move to, appease an Armenian viewership, because so much of this is about optics. It's not about, that's a big issue. But yeah, so I think it's tricky. I think it's tricky to try to do something, to try to use spaces in ways that might speak to inclusiveness without having there be, in a way that isn't sort of innocent of its own agendas. So that Akdamar liturgy is sort of really a kind of a controversial thing, and I know that I've not heard of anything like that after. So I don't think that was particularly successful as a kind of strategy to perform inclusiveness. But it's not to say that other things might not work, but that really didn't seem to do much. So anyway, just a thought.
Thank you.
Have you seen the recent coins casted? Let me share my screen. Just casted last month. This is, I think, the honorary one, and this is the 1 Turkish liras or something. So it started, I'm basically history of Hagia Sophia starting here, 53. So yeah, this is another claim.
If I can jump in, I think what Ajetta, Anna, and Christina were just discussing, it also goes to one of the questions that was in the Q&A, whether or not the museum is inherently better than the mosque, right? So there are questions about, well, what does access mean now for me as an art historian? I'm happier with the museum, in part because as a woman, I can wear whatever I want and go into the museum. And just the whole sort of headscarf police that is being imposed more and more, especially in the more touristic sites in Istanbul, which just drives me mad, although I'm normally happy to put on a headscarf out of respect, but the more somebody pushes me, the less willing I am to do that. But then there's also this idea of, right, the museum as something that's inaccessible because you have to wait in line or because it's expensive, although for Turkish citizens it was always cheaper than for tourists. And this whole idea about the museum being something that's sort of exclusive, which I think is also perhaps in part behind some of those numbers that we saw and that Anna showed us, whether or not, I mean, how actually accurate these are, that people prefer the mosque. So there's, I think, a lot to be unpacked there as well, and to just think about who can access this and how can you use it and what can you do and how can that reshape the narrative. The problem is, though, who do you talk to, right? And I think that's what also was important in Professor Ahunbay's talk last week, that it's not yet clear, even to her as a heritage professional and scholar who has been involved with the restoration of the monuments for a very long time, how that will continue and how these relationships will continue.
I think one other aspect that was brought in the presentations, and I would say to a very great extent in etches, is what channels are left for within, on the ground in Turkey, for voices of difference to express themselves. That Anna is speaking about how a regime could claim a contested site, but when you control the media, it is easier in a sense to impose that. And what happens with all these voices of reason that are leaving the country, are silenced or are in prison. So it is a very uphill battle that is created now. And it is unfortunately because of lack of freedom of expression. And I would like to turn with a question to Ali. In part one of the Hagia Sophia Forum, Lucia Ali talked about the decision of Hagia Sophia to enter the UNESCO World Monuments list was part of a large urban fabric that is included in the same protection program, which is the entire footplan of old Istanbul, Constantinople. And if you can tell us more about the change of the population in this area in the past several decades. And I will leave it open for you to let us know.
Yeah, I mean, it's obviously Istanbul lost its Greek and Armenian populations throughout the 20th century. And today, yeah, I think there are only like 3,000 Istanbulite Greeks and I think 60,000 Armenians. But at the same time, it's still a very cosmopolitan city, isn't it? I mean, there's a discussion among the Greek community. Now there are more Christian, Orthodox Christians from like Arab origin Orthodox Christians in Istanbul than the Greek, ethnically Greek origins, ethnically Greek population. So there was some interesting tensions actually between Orthodox Arabs and Orthodox Greeks. So it's very, very interesting. Dynamics going on between different, religious communities. So it's still very, very cosmopolitan city. It's, the African population, Black population is growing. Black Christian population is growing. Catholic population actually growing in the city. So the image that the city became more a kind of a homogeneous kind of urban fabric or demographics is not really true. And Istanbul is always like that. I mean, Istanbul, people claim to be from Istanbul, but I mean, who is from Istanbul? It's always like, people are coming and going, and it's an it's imperial city for many thousand years, many hundred years, and now it is a very dynamic cosmopolitan city right now, despite the whole problems, heritage issues, gentrifications, whatnot. I mean, recent change in the municipality is hopeful. I mean, it seems that they are very alert about certain issues, towards certain issues. So, in that regard, I'm optimistic about certain changes, certain projects like Taksim project. Recently, there was a public I think, Patricia, what was it? Is a public for the Taksim project? Did you follow it, or anybody did? There was a contest, public contest about Taksim, and different projects, competed. People voted, and so there's some hopeful developments. And I don't know about the nature of the relationship between the municipality and UNESCO or other international groups, but I guess that there must be some dialogue or some exchange between, but right now, I mean, the things are pretty difficult, and the government central administration is pretty somehow in panic, and they try to diminish the power of the municipalities or financial capacity of the municipalities. So there's almost like I would say, kind of a civil war between the municipalities and the central government. And in this large projects like Taksim and others, I mean, you can follow that competition or the conflict. It's interesting that the municipality didn't say much about, or Ekrem İmamoğlu, the mayor, didn't say much about Hagia Sophia. I think he did once. He said, "Well, is it really a necessity or something?" But he didn't openly oppose it. But it's clearly the atmosphere was, in July. Seems that the opposition parties also they somehow. They thought that they didn't make it a big deal out of this, which they thought would trigger certain, or contribute to the polarization. So they were rather silent towards that decision. So, to our earlier question, Bisera, I mean, what would be, or Ajessa's question about whether that would be possible, a kind of an activism. It seems that according to the opposition parties or general, some civil society organizations, it's not the right time. I don't know. This is my reading. I don't know what you say, Ajay, about that. I mean, it seems that they don't want to make it a big deal, and they rather, be silent and.
Well, they don't want to make a big deal, one, because obviously, as you said, it would contribute to the polarization. And also these municipalities are, the mayors are coming from the main opposition party, CHP. So they are trying to be centrist, so to speak, and they are becoming extreme centrists time to time. One of the examples is that Istanbul mayor, who is seen as the main political rival of Erdogan, the only possible political rival of Erdogan at this point, has bought Fatih Sultan Mehmet II's portrait from Christie's in an auction, which was quite.
Bellini portrait. Yeah.
Exactly. I wrote a piece about it, but I don't remember how much was it. It was a lot of pounds, I remember. So it was a show off in terms of this claiming the past, claiming who is the descendant of Ottoman, who is more Ottoman than the other, who is, owning the history, so to speak, claiming the history more. And this created a lot of tension among the AKP supporters. They couldn't own that portrait as the second conqueror of Istanbul, but the opponent did. I just wanted to make a point. I didn't mean neither activism nor mystification when I say physically claiming the space. Is everybody in the United States, by the way, except for me, all the panelists?
Right now, yes, all of them are in the United States.
Okay, great.
We're in California, I would say.
Yeah, I know. In 2016, when I said that you're going to have Trump as president, Americans were laughing at me. In 2019, when I said Boris Johnson will be Prime Minister of Britain, British were laughing at me. And they saw me as Cassandra. It is not that I am a Cassandra, I'm not foretelling anything. It's just there is a mechanism of populism and there are patterns that it works with. And these patterns are repeated in every country despite all the differences. And after those 7 steps are completed, from democracy to dictatorship, the same political and moral insanity takes over the country. And there is a point, and I am very, very sorry to say this, there is a point that it all boils down to physical presence. And I think in October, United States will be, American people will be witnessing this. You will have to, on that election night, when the votes are counted, you will have to be there present, like physically present, to stop poll rigging or voting fraud. So physical presence, intellectual presence is one thing, and it works until at some point it doesn't work, and you have to be there physically. So this is why I talked about physically claiming the space. I'm not talking about activism. I'm talking about, let's say, making such a panel when Corona thing is over, making this panel in Hagia Sophia itself. You see, it doesn't have to be, banners or no bras. You can wear a bra if you are willing to, or not. I am talking about doing serious work, but meanwhile being physically present there. Because when populism takes over the minds, it doesn't matter what you say, because as I pointed out earlier, there is a calculated vulgarity and ignorance that is mobilized and organized, and there is almost no way to beat that narrative. It is almost like you can cure the blindness, but you cannot cure, the reluctance to see, sort of. So physical presence matters for that reason, because there comes a point, these populist regimes consider you non-existent, basically. Legally, intellectually, emotionally, in every way. So in order to prove your presence, unfortunately, you have to physically show up. That's why I thought, being physically present in Hagia Sophia, or trying to do this might be interesting. At least it would challenge the main argument of we are preserving the place. We're not turning it into a mosque. This is what I wanted to say.
I think for the purpose of time and sticking to time, we are quite over time. And what I would suggest is we have a series of questions that were asked by the audience, and many of them will be taken up privately by the different speakers. I would like to thank all the panelists for their excellent talks. We'll have a chance to continue the discussion in another hyperspace. And I would like to thank the audience for being attentive, for raising the questions, and for following this event. Thank you all.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.